So my topic is political polarization and information sources. Over the past few years, I've become more educated in politics and have seen how there's a clear divide between our two-party system. And that's generally known as polarization. Although some may argue that it has not been growing or that it's non-existent, there's been multiple studies over the past few decades that have refuted that argument. And here we see from Pew Research Center, in 1994 and the years since, they have performed a survey and sent it out to the American population. And in this year, the median between Democrats and Republicans was generally close, and their ideologies had a high percentage of mixture. However, by 2017, we can see that the medians between the parties have drastically moved away from each other, and that's what we generally define as polarization, the distance between the two parties. And it's been 7 years since, and it can be safe to assume that this trend has only grown. But of course, what makes this even an issue that needs to be looked at? And there are several factors, and the biggest ones are social harmony, government representation, and democracy. And we're going to start with social harmony. So Shanto Iyengar and his co-authors in 2019 found that people self-report that they are less comfortable with social relationships without partisans. And essentially what that means is that more and more Americans find themselves uncomfortable in any kind of social situations, in relationships, and that can also spread to the workforce. And that obviously can lead to different things like just this distance that people have and not wanting to interact with others and being less and less exposed to different people. More critically, of course, when talking about political polarization, government and representation in that government suffer consequences as well. Alan Abramowitz and Stephen Webster, who we'll continue to talk about during this presentation, found that the growth of partisan representation combined with the regular occurrence of divided government explains why confrontation and gridlock have become the new normal in Washington, D.C. And let's break this down really quick. The growth of partisan representation, essentially what it means is that politicians in America continue to, in the past few years, have started to only prioritize the needs of their constituents and not the overall American public. And when we consider that approximately the country lays at 50-50 in both parties, that means that whenever one party is in charge of Congress or the White House or state governments, that means that 50% of the population is not, and their needs are not being taken into account. And the researchers believe that this partisan representation can explain the confrontation and gridlock, meaning the lower government efficiency that we see in Washington, D.C., and lack of cooperation. And this goes in hand with what we previously discussed about social harmony. This confrontation also stems from that, of people not wanting to work together and then being an increasing distance between the two. Lastly, within democracy, on the bigger context, Jennifer McCoy and her co-authors analyzed democracies all over the world and found that certain trends, like the growing perceptions of policies of the other as a threat, as well as the winner-take-all electoral systems and increasingly unlevel playing fields, is leading to a growing tolerance of democratic norm violations. And essentially what this means is that people become, just like we discussed in social harmony, people are starting to view those who do not share their party membership as a threat. And this winner-take-all electoral system is again referencing back to the lack of representation whenever one party is in control of some government body. And this can lead to a distolerance of democratic norm violations in terms that with all of these growing trends, Americans have become less likely to question and protest whenever politicians or others commit crimes and threaten democracy, which is obviously an issue and a worry that political science considers. Within polarization, we have a sub-level called effective polarization, which has been widely accepted as a strong indicator of the overall polarization we previously discussed. And essentially what this is the tendency for people identifying as Republican or Democrat to view opposing partisans negatively and co-partisans positively. And this stems from this principle more commonly found in psychology of in and out groups. The direct definition of effective polarization insinuates that there are two different groups, especially in the United States, being the Republicans and Democrats, and that people have preferred to stay within their own groups and do not prefer to stay with the other groups, like we previously talked again in the consequences to social harmony. However, this principle of in and out groups is not only physical. Researchers Jacob Westphal and his co-authors found that people actually perceive polarization, which can increase polarization as a whole, meaning that they create mental establishments of in and out groups, which can make them believe that the two parties are further away than they actually are. And this principle is so profound that it has not just stayed in politics, but it can also be found very commonly in information sources. And as they share certain trends, like their growth in the past few decades, as well as a basis in and out groups and sharing of information and sharing of environments, researchers have also started to analyze if there's a relationship there. So before we get into that, just quick background on how since the beginning of the century, of course, internet has become much more accessible to people. And a Pew Research Center survey from 2014 found that people did believe, they felt as though they were more informed with more access to the internet, and they felt more prone to sharing that information that they saw, especially with people who are close to them or who agree with them, which leads to the discussion of echo chambers. Echo chambers essentially are whenever people share things that they agree with to people who agree with them, and so it's just an environment of the same information and same ideas being agreed upon by multiple people. Within that, there's also connections between echo chambers and effective polarization, as people tend to stay within their own groups and to agree and trust things that are shared between their own groups. They stay in those and form echo chambers, which can actually lead to a distortion of reality and can suppress reliable resources, which takes me to emotions and trust. Emotions, researchers have found that it plays a significant role in what people share. So emotions like anger can actually make people less likely to distrust misinformation and share that misinformation, meaning that the more emotionally charged information is in the media, the more likely it is that misinformation is being passed around within these echo chambers, which presents worries for the political sciences community, as they believe that that political information could be passed along. Furthermore, although there has been this rise in social media and mainstream news as internet has grown, researchers have more and more looked at any trends within those and any qualities of the internet that could have caused or influenced a growth in polarization. However, in 2017, Levi Boxer and his co-authors actually found that those who are more likely to use it, least likely to use the internet are most likely to be polarized, which presented a potential conflict in what the field seems to have agreed on. However, they did look at only usage, and as researchers have found, if you can be exposed to different types of information, but it's what you actually interact with that reflects how you, what the media actually is within those sources and how it affects you. And so more and more people have looked at trust as a measurement of a better reflection of the media sources. However, despite the demonstrated interest recently on trust and emotion and how different sources of information can relate to polarization, no one has actually stopped to and provided empirical evidence that shows a significant association between social media, mainstream news, and the and polarization. Can I keep going?
If you want to, yes.
And so, which leads me to my question: what source of political information is associated with the highest levels of polarization among registered voters in the United States, based on their level of trust? And said sources. So, we've created, well, I've created 3 different hypotheses in response to that question. So, first of all, the null hypothesis is that there will be no sources that have an association to polarization. We have our first alternative hypothesis that says that social media, in accordance to the overall field, will have the highest association with polarization. And lastly, that our last alternative hypothesis is that social media will not have the highest association, and it will be a different source. So from now until the end of this presentation, we'll be looking at how the methodology, how I reached my methodology, and what conclusion the findings resulted in. So first of all, that decision. First, the population was narrowed down to registered voters because past research has shown that politically active individuals are more likely to be polarized. And because it has thus been established that the U.S. population is polarized, and due to the scope of my study, I wanted to narrow this population down and ensure that anything that could any association between sources and polarization would be reflected from our sampled population. Then the different sources that were found were the ones that most Americans tend to use, simply because I wanted to make sure that all participants could have a solid and accurate response to their level of trust in those sources. Additionally, that from the source from which this frequency of use was gathered looked at where people most frequently got their source of their political information from, and that is why I'm only asking about political information and not just general news. Lastly, source of trust, as previously mentioned, was due to the growing interest in the field on how trust can reflect the impact of sources, as well as the clear representation of the feelings and emotions that play along polarization. Next, the survey. This essentially was separated into 3 different parts. First, the level of trust, again, was asked for each of the sources, those sources being social media, mainstream news, cable TV, local TV, and people or acquaintances that you would talk to. And it was asked how much you trust these different sources as a source of political information, and the options were not at all, some, a lot, or fully. Then, to avoid any bias in the question of later a feeling thermometer, each participant's identity was asked, and so there would be no questions with wording such as the opposite party or the other party. And then to the feeling thermometer, this basically comes from the American National Election Surveys, and it asks how you feel about a certain thing. Within this context, it's how do you feel about the Democratic Party and how do you feel about the Republican Party. And this is measured on a scale from 0 to 10. After this survey was sent out to SurveyMonkey, I got the responses back, and analyzing it, I had to discard some responses. So first, the levels of polarization that turned out to be negative, either due to inattention from the participants or some other factor, they had to be discarded because it could not be considered in the study. Next, true independence, meaning those who did not who identify themselves as independents and do not lean one way or the other had to be eliminated because considering the actual definition of effective polarization, independence would not provide an accurate response. And lastly, the levels of trust were transformed into an artificial dichotomous value or variable. So the two lowest levels of trust were low trust, and the two higher levels of trust were renamed high trust. For the actual analysis, because based on the variables that I would be considering, I knew that I would have to use a chi-squared test that measures independence and association. And to run that test, I used the SPSS, where I put in all the remaining 400 responses and performed the test, taking into consideration Kramer's V, which is a test which shows the strength of each association. And the actual findings from those responses and from the test was that mainstream news was the only source that was not statistically significant enough to suggest that there is an association. And so we reject the null hypothesis, as all the other sources had some level of association with polarization. Also, looking at the proportions, it seems that low trust and effective polarization are most highly associated. In other words, those with an effective polarization level of 0 were more likely to have a higher level of trust in the source than were those with any other level of polarization. And this applied to all of the other sources. As we see here, all of these sources were statistically significant enough to reach a conclusion. And in fact, social media did not prove to be the one with the strongest association. Although both social media and cable TV were very strongly associated, cable TV had a higher association, while local TV and people or acquaintances had only a strong association. So in conclusion, we were going to be looking at the implications of these findings, the limitations of the study, and future direction. So first of all, the implications. Within each source, there's partisan media. So based on previous research, although it has been shown that people generally trust media that agrees with them, looking at the bigger picture, previous research by Andrew Guest and his co-authors found that with an overall distrust in a source, it can only be assumed that the umbrella sources, such as cable TV, have partisan media to an extent that has decreased their trust on the umbrella sources. Which essentially means that within these umbrella sources, specific websites with specific sources are partisan enough that the viewers and readers have grown a distrust to the umbrella term. Furthermore, based on the fact that all cable TV, local TV, and people and acquaintances had an association, the trust in them had an association with polarization, it goes to show that social media should not be the only studied source, as has been the